The flashing lights of police cruisers pierced the quiet evening on Maple Street. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering and wondering what could have brought such commotion to their sleepy suburban enclave. At the center of it all stood Margaret Johnson, a 72-year-old pillar of the community, her silver hair gleaming under the harsh glare of flashlights as two white officers towered over her small frame. Margaret's weathered hands trembled slightly as she gripped her cane, confusion and fear etched across her face. She had lived on this street for over 4 decades, tending her prized roses and hosting legendary block parties. Now, in a surreal twist, she found herself being treated like a common criminal by men young enough to be her grandsons. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," the taller officer said, his voice gruff and impatient. His partner shifted uneasily, glancing around at the growing crowd of onlookers. "But I don't understand," Margaret protested, her voice quavering. "I haven't done anything wrong. There must be some mistake." As the officers moved to restrain her, a voice rang out from the gathering throng. "Hey, what do you think you're doing? That's Ms. Johnson. She wouldn't hurt a fly." It was Tom Baker, Margaret's next-door neighbor for the past 20 years. The officers paused, exchanging uncertain glances. This wasn't how they had expected the evening to unfold. What had started as a routine call was rapidly spiraling into something far more complicated and potentially explosive. Whispers rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock and outrage building with each passing moment. Smartphones appeared, their cameras trained on the unfolding drama. In an age where every interaction between law enforcement and civilians, particularly those involving race, was scrutinized, this scene had all the makings of a powder keg. Margaret stood tall despite her fear, years of facing adversity lending her strength even in this moment of confusion. She had lived through the civil rights movement, had seen progress and setbacks, but never imagined she'd find herself in such a position at her age. "Young man," she addressed the officer who had spoken, her voice steadier now, "I think we need to take a step back and figure out what's really going on here. I've been a law-abiding citizen my entire life, and I deserve to know why I'm being treated this way." The officer's stance softened slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He had been trained to follow protocol, but something about this situation felt off. The woman before him didn't fit the description of the suspect they were looking for, not by a long shot. As tension mounted on Maple Street, none of the participants realized they were on the cusp of an event that would soon captivate the nation. The next few minutes would determine whether this would become another tragic headline or an opportunity for understanding and change. Tom Baker, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped forward. "Officers, I've known Ms. Johnson for 2 decades. If there's been some kind of misunderstanding, why don't we all take a breath and talk it through? Surely we can resolve this without anyone getting hurt." His words seemed to break the spell of confrontation. The younger officer turned to his partner, speaking in low tones. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret, her initial fear giving way to a quiet determination, stood her ground. She thought of her grandchildren, of the world she wanted to leave for them, a world where they wouldn't be judged by the color of their skin, where law enforcement and communities could work together in mutual respect and understanding. As the officers conferred, more neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Sarah Chen, a local journalist who had just moved to the area. Her reporter's instincts kicked in as she observed the scene, recognizing the potential impact of what was unfolding before her. The air crackled with tension as everyone waited for the officer's next move. Would they proceed with the arrest, potentially igniting a firestorm of controversy? Or would cooler heads prevail, offering a chance for dialogue and resolution? In that moment of uncertainty, Margaret's thoughts drifted to her late husband, a veteran who had always taught their children to stand up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. She silently drew strength from his memory, squaring her shoulders and meeting the officer's gaze with quiet dignity. The lead officer cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the tense silence. "Ma'am, it appears there may have been a miscommunication. We received a call about a disturbance, but—" He trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. Margaret saw an opening and seized it with the wisdom of her years. "Officer, I understand you have a job to do. Why don't we start over? I'm Margaret Johnson, and I've lived in this house for 43 years. If there's been a disturbance, I'd like to help if I can." Her calm demeanor seemed to reset the dynamic. The officer's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded. "Ms. Johnson, I apologize for the confusion. Can you tell us if you've seen or heard anything unusual in the neighborhood tonight?" As Margaret began to speak, recounting the quiet evening she'd spent tending to her garden, a subtle shift occurred. The confrontational energy dissipated, replaced by a tentative dialogue. Neighbors who had been watching warily now stepped closer, offering their own observations about the peaceful night. Sarah Chen, the journalist, watched the interaction with growing interest. She recognized that this moment, this near miss of a potentially tragic confrontation, held lessons that extended far beyond Maple Street. It was a microcosm of the larger issues facing communities across the nation. The delicate balance between law enforcement and civil liberties, the impact of racial biases, and the power of community engagement. As the conversation between Margaret, the officers, and the neighbors continued, no one realized that this incident would soon become a catalyst for change. The story of the night when white cops nearly arrested a beloved black elder, and what happened next, would resonate far beyond their quiet suburb. But resolution was not yet assured. As tensions eased on Maple Street, a police dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, delivering information that would reignite the uncertainty and raise the stakes even higher. The officers' eyes widened as they listened, their gazes darting between Margaret and the gathered crowd. What came next would test the fragile truths that have been established. It would challenge assumptions, push the boundaries of community-police relations, and force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, power, and the possibility of redemption. As night settled fully over Maple Street, the flashing lights of the police cruisers continued to paint the scene in surreal hues. Margaret Johnson stood at the center of it all, a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of adversity. The next few moments would determine whether this night would end in tragedy or triumph, and shape the future of a community grappling with issues that resonated across the nation. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, cutting through the uneasy calm that had settled over Maple Street. "All units, be advised. Suspect in the Oakwood robbery has been spotted 3 blocks from your location. African-American male, early 20s, wearing a red hoodie." Officer Peterson's hand instinctively moved to his holster, his gaze darting between Margaret and the surrounding houses. His partner, Officer Ramirez, tense visibly, scanning the area with renewed urgency. Margaret, attuned to the sudden shift in atmosphere, straightened her back. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice steady despite the worry creasing her brow. Before either officer could respond, a figure darted out from between 2 nearby houses, sprinting down the street. In the dim glow of streetlights, the red fabric of a hoodie was just barely visible. "Stop, police!" Officer Peterson shouted, breaking into a run. Officer Ramirez hesitated for a split second, torn between following his partner and maintaining control of the scene on Maple Street. The crowd that had gathered around Margaret surged forward, a mix of confusion and concern rippling through them. Tom Baker, still standing protectively near his elderly neighbor, called out, "Officers, what's going on? Is there danger?" Sarah Chen, the journalist, felt her heart race as she realized she was witnessing a story unfolding in real time. Her fingers flew across her phone screen, taking rapid notes. In the chaos of the moment, Margaret's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Everyone, please stay calm. Let's not make this situation any more difficult than it needs to be." Her words seemed to have a grounding effect on the crowd. Neighbors who had been on the verge of panic took deep breaths, looking to the elderly woman for guidance. Officer Ramirez, making a split-second decision, addressed the group. "Folks, we have a potential suspect in the area. Please return to your homes and lock your doors. We'll update you as soon as we can." As people reluctantly began to disperse, Margaret stood her ground. "Officer," she said, her tone brooking no argument, "I may be old, but I'm not helpless. How can I assist you in keeping this neighborhood safe?" Ramirez blinked, taken aback by the offer. In his years on the force, he'd encountered plenty of hostile civilians, but rarely someone so willing to breach the gap between law enforcement and the community. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Officer Peterson was in hot pursuit of the fleeing figure. His breath came in sharp bursts as he rounded a corner, nearly losing sight of the suspect. "Stop, police!" he shouted again, frustration edging his voice. The chase led them through winding back alleys and across moonlit yards. Peterson could feel his adrenaline surging, memories of academy training mingling with the real-world stakes of the moment. He knew the risks of a high-speed foot pursuit, to himself, to the suspect, to innocent bystanders. But the thought of letting a potentially dangerous criminal escape spurred him on. Back on Maple Street, a tense waiting game had begun. Most neighbors had retreated to the safety of their homes, but a core group remained outside with Margaret and Officer Ramirez. Among them were Tom Baker, Sarah Chen, and a few other longtime residents who refused to leave their elderly friend alone in such a fraught situation. Margaret, leaning on her cane but standing tall, turned to Ramirez. "Young man," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I've lived in this neighborhood for longer than you've been alive. I know every nook and cranny, every shortcut and hiding spot. If your suspect is nearby, I might be able to help you find him." Ramirez hesitated, protocol warring with practicality. Involving a civilian, especially an elderly one, in a potentially dangerous situation went against everything he'd been taught. But something in Margaret's steady gaze made him reconsider. "Ms. Johnson," he said slowly, "I appreciate your offer, but I can't put you in harm's way. It's my job to protect you and everyone else here." Margaret's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "Who said anything about putting me in harm's way? I'm suggesting we use our collective knowledge to help you do your job more effectively. After all, isn't community policing about working together?" Her words struck a chord. Ramirez had joined the force with idealistic notions of bridging gaps between law enforcement and the communities they served. Recent years had seen those ideals tested, but here was an opportunity to put them into practice. As they spoke, Sarah Chen listened intently, her journalistic instincts on high alert. She recognized that she was witnessing something remarkable, a potential model for how police and civilians could interact in high-stress situations. Suddenly, the crackle of the radio broke through their conversation. "Officer down. Repeat, officer down. Requesting immediate backup at the corner of Elm and 4th. The color drained from Ramirez's face. Without a word, he sprinted towards his patrol car, torn between his duty to respond and his responsibility to the people on Maple Street. Margaret's voice rang out, strong and clear. "Go, we'll be fine here. Your partner needs you." With a grateful nod, Ramirez peeled away, sirens blaring into the night. The small group left behind on Maple Street stood in stunned silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Tom Baker was the first to speak. "What do we do now?" Margaret's response was immediate. "We do what neighbors do. We look out for each other." She turned to Sarah Chen. "Young lady, you're a journalist, right? I think it's time we got the word out about what's happening here. People need to know the truth, not just rumors." As Sarah nodded, already formulating how to report on the unfolding events responsibly, Margaret continued. "Tom, can you and the others start a phone tree? Let's make sure everyone in the neighborhood is aware and safe." With a sense of purpose, the small group began to mobilize. What had started as a frightening confrontation was transforming into a demonstration of community solidarity. But even as they worked together, questions lingered. What had really happened to Officer Peterson? Who was the mysterious suspect in the red hoodie? And how would this night, which had already taken so many unexpected turns, ultimately end? As sirens wailed in the distance and neighbors reached out to one another, Margaret Johnson stood at the heart of it all. Her quiet strength and unwavering belief in the power of community were about to be put to the ultimate test. The night was far from over, and the true impact of these events was yet to be revealed. On Maple Street and beyond, lives were about to change in ways no one could have predicted when the sun set that evening. As the night deepened, the events on Maple Street began to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond its quiet suburban boundaries. In a dimly lit emergency room across town, Officer Peterson lay on a gurney, his face etched with pain. The chase had ended abruptly when he'd lost his footing, tumbling down a steep embankment. Now, as doctors bustled around him, his mind raced with unanswered questions. "I need to get back out there," he groaned, attempting to sit up despite the shooting pain in his leg. A firm hand on his shoulder pushed him back down. "Not so fast, officer," the attending physician said sternly. "You've got a nasty sprain and possible concussion. You're not going anywhere for a while." Peterson's frustration was palpable. He'd lost the suspect, gotten himself injured, and now felt utterly useless. As he lay there, His thoughts drifted to the scene he'd left behind on Maple Street. What had happened after he'd taken off in pursuit? Was his partner okay? And what about that elderly woman they'd nearly arrested by mistake? Meanwhile, in a small apartment just blocks from where Peterson had fallen, 22-year-old Marcus Thompson huddled in the dark, his heart pounding. He ditched the red hoodie in a dumpster, but fear still coursed through his veins. This wasn't how things were supposed to go down. Marcus had never intended to become a suspect in a robbery. He'd been walking home from his late-night shift at the local diner when he'd spotted the police cars on Maple Street. Panic had set in. He'd had run-ins with law enforcement before, mostly due to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So when he saw the officers, his instinct had been to run. Now, as he sat in the darkness of his apartment, Marcus wrestled with what to do next. He hadn't committed any crime, but running from the police had only made him look guilty. And with tensions already high in the community, he feared what might happen if he tried to turn himself in. Back on Maple Street, Margaret Johnson had transformed her living room into an impromptu command center. Neighbors came and went, sharing updates and offering support. Sarah Chen sat in a corner, furiously typing on her laptop, trying to piece together the complex narrative of the night's events. "Mrs. Johnson," Sarah said, looking up from her screen. "I've been thinking. This story, it's not just about what almost happened to you. It's about our community, about police-civilian relations, about race and age, and so much more. How do you think we should approach telling it?" Margaret paused, considering the question carefully. "My dear," she replied, "I think we need to tell the whole truth, from all sides. It's the only way we'll ever move forward." As they spoke, Officer Ramirez returned to Maple Street, his face a mask of concern. He'd been to the hospital to check on his partner, and was now grappling with the pressure of managing this increasingly complex situation alone. "Ms. Johnson," he said, approaching Margaret with a mix of respect and wariness, "I need your help. The suspect is still at large, and tensions in the community are rising. I'm worried things could get out of hand if we don't find a way to bring everyone together." Margaret nodded, a plan already forming in her mind. "Officer, I think it's time we had a community meeting. Right here, right now. Let's get everyone involved. Police, neighbors, even the media. It's time we all started talking to each other instead of about each other." As word of the impromptu meeting spread, people began to gather in Margaret's backyard. Tom Baker fired up the old barbecue, the familiar smell of grilling burgers adding an incongruously normal touch to the surreal night. Among those who slipped into the gathering was Marcus Thompson, his decision made. He discarded the red hoodie and dressed in a plain white t-shirt, his hands shaking slightly as he approached Officer Ramirez. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think I might be the person you've been looking for. But I swear, I didn't rob anybody. I just got scared and ran." Ramirez tensed, his hand moving instinctively towards his weapon. But then he caught sight of Margaret watching him, her gaze steady and challenging. In that moment, he made a choice that would change the course of the night, and perhaps his entire career. "Son," he said, deliberately moving his hand away from his holster, "why don't you come and sit down? I think we all need to hear your story." As Marcus began to speak, his voice gaining strength, the gathered crowd listened in rapt attention. Sarah Chen's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word. This, she realized, was the heart of the story. Not just a tale of misunderstanding and near tragedy, but one of courage, community, and the possibility of change. But even as a sense of understanding began to grow among those gathered in Margaret's backyard, challenges loomed. Across town, the victim of the actual robbery was giving a statement that would soon complicate matters. And in the hospital, Officer Peterson was making a decision that would send shockwaves through the police department. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky, the gathering in Margaret's backyard had taken on an almost surreal quality. Marcus Thompson's story hung in the air, a testament to the misunderstandings and fears that had shaped the night's events. Officer Ramirez stood to the side, his face a mask of conflicting emotions as he weighed his duty against the unfolding human drama before him. Suddenly, the crackle of a police radio cut through the murmur of conversation. "All units, be advised. New information on the Oakwood robbery suspect. White male, approximately 30 years old, last seen driving a blue sedan." A hush fell over the crowd as the implications of this update sank in. Marcus, who had been sitting with his head in his hands, looked up, a mix of relief and lingering fear in his eyes. Officer Ramirez reached for his radio, his hand hesitating for a moment before he responded. "Dispatch, this is Officer Ramirez. Can you confirm that description?" "Over." As they waited for a response, Sarah Chen's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing the mounting tension. She glanced at Margaret, who stood like a calm center in the eye of the storm, her weathered hands gripping her cane as she surveyed the scene before her. The radio crackled again. "Confirmation on new suspect description. Proceed with caution. All available units respond." A collective exhale seemed to ripple through the gathering. But before anyone could fully process this new information, a commotion at the edge of the yard drew everyone's attention. Officer Peterson limped into view, his face pale with pain and determination. He'd left the hospital against medical advice, driven by a mixture of duty and a gnawing sense of unfinished business. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes widening as he took in the unlikely assembly before him. His gaze locked onto Marcus, recognition flashing across his face. You're the one who ran." The tension in the air became palpable as Peterson started forward, his hand moving towards his holster. Ramirez stepped between his partner and Marcus, his voice low and urgent. "Pete, wait. You don't have all the facts. Things have changed." As the two officers faced off, the crowd began to stir uneasily. The fragile understanding that had been building throughout the night teetered on the brink of collapse. It was Margaret who broke the standoff, her voice cutting through the tension like a beacon in the darkness. "Gentlemen," she said, stepping forward with a grace that belied her years, "I think it's time we all took a deep breath and remembered why we're here." She turned to address the gathered neighbors, her voice gaining strength with each word. "We spent this night confronting our fears, our assumptions, and our differences. But we've also discovered our common ground. Are we going to let all of that progress slip away now?" As Margaret spoke, a police siren wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The sound seemed to electrify the air, a reminder that the world beyond Maple Street was rapidly closing in. Sarah Chen, recognizing the pivotal moment unfolding before her, raised her voice. "Mrs. Johnson is right. Whatever happens next, we need to document this. The world needs to know what's happened here tonight." Officer Peterson, still tense but clearly conflicted, looked from Marcus to his partner to Margaret. "I don't understand," he said, his voice a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "What exactly has been going on while I was gone?" As Ramirez began to explain, another figure burst into the yard. It was Tom Baker, his face flushed with exertion. "They got him," he exclaimed. "The real robber. It's all over the police scanner." A ripple of excitement ran through the crowd, but it was tempered by the realization that their ordeal wasn't over yet. The approaching sirens grew louder, a reminder that the events of Maple Street were about to collide with the larger forces of law enforcement and media attention. Margaret's voice cut through the growing clamor. "All right, everyone. This is the moment of truth. How we handle what comes next will determine whether this night becomes a tragedy or a turning point." As if on cue, a fleet of police cars and news vans began to appear at the end of Maple Street, their lights painting the pre-dawn sky in flashes of red and blue. Officer Ramirez turned to his partner, his voice low and urgent. "Pete, we've got about 30 seconds to decide how we're going to play this. Whatever we do next is going to have consequences far beyond this street." Peterson looked around, taking in the scene. Marcus, trembling but standing his ground. Sarah, her camera at the ready. The neighbors, a diverse group united in their concern. And Margaret, a pillar of quiet strength at the center of it all. The approaching vehicles screeched to a halt at the edge of Margaret's property. Car doors began to slam, and a cacophony of voices filled the air. In that moment, with the world poised to descend upon Maple Street, every person in Margaret's backyard faced a choice, one that would define not just the end of this extraordinary night, but the future of their community. As the first reporters and additional officers began to push their way into the yard, Margaret stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Wait," she called. "Before anyone says or does anything, there's something you all need to hear." All eyes turned to the elderly woman, her small frame somehow commanding the chaotic scene. The story of Maple Street teetered on a knife's edge, with the power to spark controversy or inspire change. In the breathless pause that followed Margaret's words, the future hung in the balance. waiting to be written. As Margaret's voice rang out across the yard, a hush fell over the crowd. Even the newly arrived officers and reporters seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, posing in their tracks. But before Margaret could continue, a commotion at the edge of the gathering drew everyone's attention. A man pushed his way through the crowd, his face a mask of anger and fear. "That's him," he shouted, pointing directly at Marcus. "That's the guy who robbed my store." The yard erupted into chaos. Officers moved to surround Marcus, who stood frozen in shock. Sarah Chen's camera whirred as she captured the unfolding scene. Neighbors who had just moments ago been united in purpose now looked at each other with uncertainty and suspicion. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din. "Everyone, please remain calm." "Sir," he addressed the newcomer, "are you absolutely certain about this identification?" The man, who introduced himself as the owner of the Oakwood convenience store, nodded vigorously. "I'll never forget that face. He was wearing a red hoodie, just like you said on the radio. I saw him run out of my store and down Maple Street." Marcus, finding his voice at last, protested. "No, you've got it all wrong. I was at work. I can prove it." As tensions escalated, Margaret's steady voice once again commanded attention. "Now, let's not jump to conclusions. We've already seen tonight how easily misunderstandings can spiral out of control. There's more to this story than meets the eye." She turned to Marcus, her gaze both compassionate and piercing. "Young man, you told us you were walking home from work when all this started. Can you tell us exactly where you work and at what time you left?" Marcus, his voice shaking, replied, "I worked the late shift at Rosie's Diner, just a few blocks from here. I clocked out at 11:30 p.m. and started walking home." A murmur ran through the crowd. Tom Baker spoke up, "But the robbery happened around midnight, right? That timing seems awfully tight." Officer Peterson, who had been observing silently, suddenly straightened. "Wait a minute. Rosie's Diner. That's right next to the convenience store that was robbed. Did you see or hear anything suspicious when you left work?" Marcus's eyes widened as realization dawned. I did see someone hanging around outside the store when I left. He was wearing a red hoodie, just like mine. I didn't think much of it at the time, but..." The store owner, listening intently, looked confused. "But I could have sworn." Sarah Chen, her journalistic instincts on high alert, stepped forward. "Sir, is it possible that in the stress of the moment, you might have confused Marcus with the actual robber? They were both wearing similar clothing." As the implications of this possibility sank in, a new wave of tension swept through the gathering. The police officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. The story that had seemed so clear-cut just moments ago was unraveling, revealing layers of complexity that no one had anticipated. Suddenly, Officer Ramirez's radio crackled to life. "All units, be advised. Suspect in the Oakwood robbery has been apprehended. Suspect is in possession of stolen goods and weapon." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Marcus slumped in relief, while the store owner looked stricken. The officers stood frozen, the weight of nearly arresting an innocent man settling heavily on their shoulders. But even as this news sank in, Margaret's keen eyes caught something that others had missed. A figure at the edge of the yard, partially hidden behind a tree, was slowly backing away from the scene. There was something familiar about the way he moved, something that tugged at her memory. "Wait," she called out, her voice carrying an urgency that made everyone turn. "That man there, I know him. He's not from this neighborhood." As all eyes turned to follow Margaret's gaze, the figure broke into a run. Without hesitation, Officers Peterson and Ramirez sprinted after him, their earlier disagreements forgotten in the heat of the chase. The yard erupted into motion. Neighbors called out directions, pointing the way as the suspect darted between houses. Sarah Chen, caught up in the moment, found herself running alongside Tom Baker, her camera bouncing against her side as they followed the pursuit. In the chaos, no one noticed the store owner slip away, a look of guilt and fear on his face. No one, that is, except Margaret, who watched his retreat with a mixture of sadness and understanding. As the sound of the chase faded into the distance, those left behind in Margaret's yard looked at each other with a new sense of uncertainty. The night that had already defied explanation was taking yet another unexpected turn. Marcus, still reeling from his near arrest and sudden exoneration, turned to Margaret. Mrs. Johnson, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, what's really going on here? Margaret's eyes, wise with years of observing human nature, scanned the faces around her. I think, she said slowly, we're about to uncover a truth that goes far beyond a simple robbery. And I have a feeling that by the time this night is over, our community will never be the same. As the first rays of sunrise began to paint the sky, casting long shadows across Maple Street, the residents found themselves on the cusp of a revelation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their quiet suburban enclave. The real story, it seemed, was only just beginning to unfold. The chase through the quiet streets of the neighborhood ended abruptly in the local park. Officers Peterson and Ramirez, breathing heavily, cornered the fleeing suspect near the old bandstand. As they approached cautiously, the man's features became clearer in the growing light of dawn. Wait a minute, Peterson said, recognition dawning on his face. I know this guy, he's not just some random criminal. The suspect, realizing he was trapped, raised his hand slowly. All right, you got me. But trust me, there's more to this story than you think. Back in Margaret's yard, the remaining neighbors huddled together, anxiously awaiting news. Sarah Chen, who had returned from following the chase, was busy piecing together the night's events, her journalist's mind racing to connect the dots. Suddenly, a police car pulled up, and out stepped a detective in plain clothes. He surveyed the scene with a mixture of confusion and interest. I'm Detective Morris, he announced. I've been working undercover on a case that I think just collided with whatever's been happening here tonight. As if on cue, officers Peterson and Ramirez returned, escorting their captive. The crowd gasped as they recognized him. It was the assistant manager from the local bank. Detective Morris nodded grimly. Just as I suspected. We've been investigating a string of small-time robberies in the area, but we could never figure out how the perpetrators were always one step ahead of us. Now it all makes sense. The assistant bank manager, seeing no way out, began to talk. It was supposed to be the perfect scheme. Use my position at the bank to get information on local businesses' cash flows, then hit them when they were most vulnerable. I'd feed false information to the police to keep them chasing their tails. Margaret, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. And the convenience store robbery tonight? Was that part of your plan too? The man nodded reluctantly. It was supposed to be a simple job, but then everything went sideways. The kid in the red hoodie, Marcus, he spooked me when he walked by. I panicked and ran. Then I saw the cops show up here and thought I could use the confusion to slip away. As the truth unfolded, the gathered neighbors looked at each other in astonishment. The quiet suburb they thought they knew had been hiding secrets beneath its peaceful exterior. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing. What about the store owner? Sarah Chen asked, her reporter's instinct sensing there was more to the story. Detective Morris sighed. We found him a few blocks away. Turns out he was in on it too. He'd been struggling to keep his business afloat and got pulled into the scheme. The robbery tonight was staged to throw us off the scent of the larger operation. The revelation sent shockwaves through the group. Friends and neighbors they'd known for years had been living double lives right under their noses. As the full scope of the night's events sank in, Margaret's voice rose above the murmurs of the crowd. Well, she said, her tone a mixture of sadness and determination, it seems our little community has been through quite an ordeal. But I think we've also learned something important about ourselves and each other. She turned to Marcus, who stood quietly at the edge of the group. Young man, I believe we owe you an apology. Your race and age led many to jump to conclusions, myself included. We can and must do better. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, extending his hand to Marcus. She's right. I'm sorry for how we treated you earlier. Your cooperation helped us uncover a much bigger crime. Thank you. As Marcus hesitantly shook the officer's hand, a ripple of applause spread through the gathering. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the beginning of something significant. Sarah Chen, who had been furiously taking notes, looked up with a gleam in her eye. This is an incredible story of prejudice, community, and unexpected twists. But I think the real story here is how a neighborhood came together to uncover the truth. As the group nodded in agreement, Detective Morris cleared his throat. I hate to break up this moment, but there's one more thing you should know. He paused, looking around at the expectant faces. This case goes deeper than just your neighborhood. We have reason to believe it's connected to a larger network of white-collar crime across the state. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Just when they thought the night couldn't hold any more surprises, they found themselves at the center of a story much bigger than they could have imagined. Margaret, ever the voice of reason, spoke up. Well, it seems our little Maple Street has quite a tale to tell, but more importantly, we have work to do, not just in helping with this investigation, but in rebuilding the trust in our community. As the first full rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, illuminating the gathered faces of neighbors, police officers, and newfound allies, there was a sense of both ending and beginning. The night of confusion, fear, and revelation was over, but the real journey, one of healing, understanding, and change, was just beginning. Sarah Chen, capturing the moment on her camera, smiled to herself. This wasn't just a story of one wild night in suburbia. It was a microcosm of the challenges and possibilities facing communities across the nation. And as she looked around at the diverse group of people who had come together to uncover the truth, she knew that the real story, the story of what happened next, was going to be even more powerful. As the impromptu gathering on Maple Street began to disperse, with promises to meet again soon, there was a palpable sense of transformation in the air. They had entered the night as strangers and adversaries, divided by assumptions and fears. They emerged as a community, united by a shared experience and a commitment to do better. The saga of the night when white cops nearly arrested a black elderly woman had taken turns no one could have predicted. But in the end, it wasn't just about race, or crime, or mistaken identities. It was about the power of a community to face its flaws, challenge its assumptions, and come together in pursuit of justice and understanding. As Margaret watched her neighbors leave, their faces a mix of exhaustion and hope, she knew that the story of Maple Street was far from over. In fact, she thought with a small smile, it might just be the beginning of something truly remarkable. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the residents of Maple Street slowly dispersed, each carrying with them the weight of the night's revelations. Margaret Johnson, still standing in her yard, watched as neighbors exchanged phone numbers and promises to stay in touch. The sense of community that had been forged in the crucible of this extraordinary night was palpable. Sarah Chen, her camera finally at rest, approached Margaret with a look of admiration. "Mrs. Johnson, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. Your wisdom and courage held us all together when things could have fallen apart." Margaret smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Oh, my dear, I'm just an old woman who's seen enough of life to know that understanding is the key to everything. Now, tell me, what will you do with this story?" Sarah's eyes lit up with determination. "I'm going to tell it, all of it. The mistaken arrest, the real crime, the way this community came together. People need to know that change is possible, that we can overcome our prejudices and work together." As they spoke, Officer Ramirez approached, his face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Ms. Johnson, Ms. Chen, I wanted to thank you both. This night, it's changed how I see my job, my community. I got a lot to think about." Margaret reached out and patted his arm. "That's all any of us can do, young man. Think, learn, and try to do better next time." Across the yard, Marcus Thompson stood quietly, still processing the events of the night. Tom Baker, noticing his solitude, walked over. "Hey, son," he said gently, "you doing okay?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so. It's just a lot, you know? I never expected to be at the center of something like this." Tom nodded understandingly. "None of us did. But you showed real courage tonight. This community owes you an apology and a debt of gratitude." As they talked, Detective Morris approached, his face serious. "Mr. Thompson, I know this has been a difficult night for you, but I want you to know that your actions helped us crack a case that's been troubling us for months. We'll need your statement, but after that, you're free to go. And I'm sorry for what you went through." Marcus straightened, a newfound confidence in his posture. "Thank you, Detective. I'm glad I could help. And I think I'd like to learn more about law enforcement. Maybe there's a way I can help bridge the gap between the police and the community." Detective Morris smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We could certainly use more people like you. Let's talk about it once the dust settles." As the morning wore on, the last of the police cars and news vans departed, leaving Maple Street to absorb the events of the night in peace. Margaret, ever the gracious host, invited those who remained for a late breakfast. Gathered around her dining room table, an unlikely group shared coffee and conversation. Sarah Chen, her notebook open beside her plate, listened intently as Margaret regaled them with stories of the neighborhood's history. Officer Ramirez, his uniform rumpled from the long night, found himself deep in conversation with Marcus about community policing initiatives. Tom Baker, helping himself to another slice of toast, shook his head in wonder. "You know," he mused, "I've lived on this street for 20 years, but I feel like I'm really seeing my neighbors for the first time." As the conversation flowed, the doorbell rang. Margaret excused herself to answer it, returning moments later with a surprised look on her face. "Well," she announced, "it seems our little gathering has attracted some attention." Behind her stood the mayor, looking both concerned and intrigued. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, stepping into the room, "I've been hearing some extraordinary reports about what happened here last night. I thought I should come see for myself." The room fell silent as the mayor took in the scene. The diverse group of faces, the easy camaraderie that had formed among former strangers. Margaret, ever composed, gestured to an empty chair. "Why don't you join us, Mr. Mayor? We were just discussing some ideas for bringing our community closer together." As the mayor took a seat, the conversation resumed, now with an added layer of purpose. Ideas flowed freely: community forums, joint training sessions between citizens and police, programs to support struggling local businesses. Sarah Chen, her journalistic instincts on high alert, couldn't help but smile. This was no longer just a story about one dramatic night. It was evolving into a blueprint for community transformation. As the impromptu meeting wound down, the mayor stood, his face thoughtful. "I came here expecting to do damage control," he admitted. "Instead, I think I found a model for positive change. Mrs. Johnson, would you be willing to head up a community task force to implement some of these ideas?" Margaret's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Well, Mr. Mayor, at my age I thought I was done with new adventures. But it seems life had other plans. I'd be honored." As the guests began to depart, each carried with them a sense of purpose and hope. Officer Ramirez shook hands warmly with Marcus, promising to stay in touch about internship opportunities at the police department. Sarah Chen exchanged contact information with everyone, determined to follow this story as it unfolded. Tom Baker, the last to leave, paused at the door. "Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've never been more proud to be your neighbor." Left alone in her suddenly quiet house, Margaret sank into her favorite armchair, feeling the weight of the night's events settle over her. She picked up a framed photo from the side table, a picture of her late husband in his military uniform. "Well, Harold," she said softly, "it seems our little street still has some fight left in it. I think you would have liked what you saw today." As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Margaret allowed herself a moment of reflection. The night had begun with fear and misunderstanding, but it had ended with hope and unity. There was still work to be done, bridges to be built, and trust to be earned. But for the first time in years, it felt like real change was possible. Outside, life on Maple Street was returning to normal, or at least, a new version of normal. Neighbors who had once passed each other with nothing more than a nod were now stopping to chat. Children played freely, their parents watching with a newfound sense of community responsibility. And in homes across the street, people were making calls, sending emails, and posting on social media. The story of Maple Street was spreading, inspiring others to look at their own communities with fresh eyes. As evening approached, Margaret stood on her porch, watching the sun set on a day that had dawned with uncertainty but was ending with promise. She knew there would be challenges ahead, setbacks and disagreements. Change never came easy. But as she looked out at her neighborhood, at the mingling of families, the respectful nod of a passing police patrol, the young journalist typing away on her laptop in the coffee shop across the street, Margaret felt a surge of hope. The night when white cops almost arrested a black elderly woman had become something much more. It had become the night when a community found its voice, its courage, and its shared humanity. As the street lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over Maple Street, Margaret smiled to herself. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And she, for one, couldn't wait to see what the next chapter would bring.